that we feel that the science isn't settled yet, and that any prohibition prior to the completion of these credible studies is really premature. And as a result, we would request that a resolution be more in line with the recommendations of the Waste Tire Subcommittee, which we feel do recognize the ongoing science and recognize that there's some time horizons coming out there. Certainly there are community concerns, but there are also a lot of community desire for this type of facility. We want to ensure that there's compliance with the concurrent NPP 20 ordinances, and also would like to see some kind of timeline connection to the ongoing California and EPA studies, because that discussion may change when those studies are completed. With that, I will conclude, and as Jane Miller mentioned earlier, there's a group of us here who are able to answer questions, and we may tag team that depending on exactly what the question is, but we will stand for your questions, and thank you for the time.
Okay. Why don't you stay right there? Sure. And I know we had a question from Councilmember Frey. So.
Thank you, Madam Vice President.
Yep.
So first, you mentioned that this resolution would not be in compliance with the joint agreement between the city and the parks, and I'm assuming that's because the joint agreement itself stated that we would not have authority over how the money would be used once it was in your hands. Is that right?
Chair Glidden and Councilmember Frey, that's exactly right. The ordinance is very clear about that.
So first off, I think just from a legal perspective, we've already passed a resolution. There's absolutely no question here. Second, I do think, speaking as someone who quite literally bathed in this stuff from when I was 9 years old to when I was 27 years old, every single high school track in the entire country through this time pretty much was used with this material. And I actually, I don't know what the results of this California study would be, so obviously I have some selfish personal concern there, but I would like to see what the results ultimately say.
Councilmember Goodman.
Isn't it, aren't regular grass fields just covered in fertilizer? I mean, to get a really green lawn, I mean, this has been my experience at my farmhouse and now at my city house. I mean, fertilizer to keep a field in play form, to have it be worthy of like kids playing on it, really needs actually something we hate even more than this crushed rubber we're not sure we hate yet, which is fertilizer, right?
Generally speaking, yeah, there would be some sort of a chemical that would be needed to treat any, weed prevention like that. I mean, you want to have a high quality turf field that people are going to use. Irrigation is a big component of that. Your sub-drainage is part of that. But there's also, I mean, in my opinion, in my experience, you do have some surface treatment that is required as well. And some sort of, pesticide, herbicide would be required.
Oh, yeah. So water too, like lots of water.
Yeah. And Chair Glidden and Councilmember Goodman, let me also reiterate that is in particular in our premier fields. We do have a pesticide policy for our neighborhood parks. So in the non-premier fields, we wouldn't. But one of the other issues for us is that the playability of those fields. I mean, one of the major issues we have had is that the high density and use of our fields makes them basically unplayable. And if you go to a natural turf field, we either have to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars rebuilding that field, close it off until the infill has happened with the grass, and then regulate who and when it can be used, or otherwise within a year, that field will be unplayable again because of the heavy use on those fields.
And what happens, I'm just curious, in the suburbs? So you would think that, I mean, one of the problems we have is that we're constantly compared in terms of athletic facilities and schools and theater programs and sports programs to the suburbs. So what are the suburbs doing? They probably have some pretty great fields, I guess.
I did grow up in the suburbs, live in Minneapolis currently. When I grew up playing in the suburbs, you're right, there were some really quality high fields around the metro area. I can't answer, though, exactly what they do, but I have to imagine that everybody's kind of following very similar practices, and it's water, it's some sort of a pesticide that's getting used to treat those fields. Or they're having artificial fields, correct.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you. I have a few questions. My first question is, why was I told that the Curry Field used shoes? And when it was put in, I went to a grand opening there. I was shown a Nike tennis shoe. I was assured that they were using tennis shoe crumb to be put in that field. And now you come in here today and you say there's not tennis shoe tire crumb used on that field. I don't get it. Can anybody explain that to me?
I'm not aware of that.
I was at the event with Scott Vreeland. He showed me the shoe. It was explained to me that they were using Nike. I think it was Nike actually had done that and put that in there. So apparently that's not true, and maybe Scott will recall something totally different.
I have never said that it was crumb rubber from shoes. I don't ever remember holding up a shoe. I have no explanation for why you and I totally remember different things, but I have always known that it was not made with Nike shoes, and I would not have said that.
Okay. Interesting. Then why aren't you using alternatives, and what other alternatives have you studied? Why wouldn't be using shoe crumb rubber if it's available and it's something that's actually manufactured for people to wear?
I think this is more a staff question.
Yeah.
If we could have staff respond just
Good.
from the staff perspective. I know policymakers are aware of kind of things that are all happening, but I think this is more a staff question.
Certainly.
What's the usage that's being considered or used right now? Thank you.
I can answer part of the question. The question about what other products are there out there, there definitely are other products. There are other rubber products. Recycled shoes is one of those rubber products that can be used. There's organic materials that have been talked about that can be used with artificial turf fields. There's even sand materials, coated sand, natural sand that can be used. So there are other alternatives out there. When you think about what materials there are, what are the implications to using different materials, cost is a big part of that. Crumb rubber is one of the most commonly used products out there, and as a reason, it's one of the most economical products to use. When you go up into the other levels of different material for infill that could be used, your costs can double. There are other alternatives. Cost is a reason as to why decisions generally get made as to what the infill material is going to be.
Do you have any idea why the waste tire is so inexpensive?
From what I've gathered, there's a high level of tires out there, and it's just easier to recycle those. With shoes, the research I have found talks about that there's just limited capacity of a number of shoes to actually be used to successfully provide infill for a field itself. So it's a capacity concern when you talk about recycled tires recycled tires versus shoes.
And tires can't be burned in a waste burner because they're so toxic?
I can't answer that question. I'm sorry.
They can't be. They're so hazardous. They're not allowed to be burned because there's so many poisons in them. And tires can't be put away effectively in landfills.
Again, they talk about tire usage and the fact that they go into landfills. At least this is extending. This allows them to actually not go into a landfill and be used successfully out in the field, with research showing that it's not a health concern.
Some research says that it is a health concern. We actually heard lots of testimony. We had expert people that came before us, lots of parents who were very concerned about this. We heard from the dean from the School of Global Health at Mount Sinai Hospital. He said the use of waste tires for playground mulch and crumb rubber athletic field infill potentially puts the health of children and athletes at risk. My first concern is health risks from heat effects of vigorously exercising on crumb rubber fields, because the crumb rubber material absorbs solar radiation on hot sunny days. Temperatures can reach 130 degrees and as high as 173 degrees. This environment puts children at risk for heat-induced illness such as dehydration, heat stress, heat stroke, and heat burns. My second serious concern with the use of crumb rubber on playgrounds and fields is exposure to toxic chemicals, including 1,3-butadiene, a known human carcinogen and an integral component of the synthetic rubber used in the manufacture of most tires, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs, also known carcinogens, volatile organic compounds, many of which are neurotoxic, and heavy metals such as lead. Many of the chemicals in crumb rubber volatilize, especially in hot weather, and can be inhaled. The crumb rubber pellets stick to children's hands and bodies and can be ingested when children put their hands in their mouths. I'm curious about if you've thought about putting these fields in some of the areas of our city that are already overburdened with toxins, places that we're already identifying as potential green zones because of how many chemicals and poisons that the children in those areas are already exposed to. Are you taking that into consideration when you make your decision to go with the less expensive tires, or maybe something that may be less harmful, such as tennis shoes?
Councilmember Gordon, our decisions on where the premier fields are placed throughout our system are really based on our master planning processes, which involve the community engagement and throughout these entire project areas. I can speak from experience in the South Service area, which is a project that I led, that there was a robust discussion around this issue as recommendations began to come forward from the community to include additional premier fields in the service area. It was not a decision that was taken lightly. We had community meetings where the conversation went back and forth. And at the end of the day, the determination was made and supported by the community to increase the size of some of the fields and to add additional fields because of all the other benefits that the community felt that those bring to the table. So I can certainly understand your concern, but I will say that we're not placing these fields around in places where we don't hear that there's a particular need for that premier field environment that comes up from the community.
So are you taking, you could create a premier field without using the ground up tires, correct?
Yes, there are other options for creating a premier field.
And have you presented those other options, especially in these areas where the children are already overburdened with toxins, have high rates of asthma, some of the highest lead levels of the state?
Chair Glidden, Council Member Gordon, yes, we have at these meetings talked about different options, including natural turf, which has the drawbacks of needing to be closed for some periods of time and have restricted access, which is typically not desired by the community. And again, I will say that our premier field does not have a defined surface. We are continuing to explore other options. We just know at this moment those other options are more expensive, and we have to consider that in the context of the community priorities within a particular park.
I appreciate that, and I guess I'll just try to have one more question, although there's just a wealth of information that we learned at the committee and also at the advisory groups. And certainly the park board perspective was presented, and a lot of this also is the tire industry perspective that gets presented, because there is just an enormous pressure on them to do something with these waste tires, which clearly were not manufactured to be played on by children. We, in fact, at our very first meeting, heard from a park commissioner who spoke to us and said that she was very interested in seeing how we could get these tires out of the city, that she didn't support their use. And I'm just curious, has the park board ever actually taken a vote on whether or not to use the waste tires on the fields, and what was that vote?
Vice President Glidden, Councilmember Gordon, yes, we take a vote every single time we install a field, because all the fields that we install are very expensive. So when we, before we install any of our fields, we always take a vote. I guess the other thing I'd like to make sure people understand is we're really not in the business of trying to poison children. And of course, we would never try to do anything that we think would do that. We're in a built environment. We're in a city that, where we use pretty much every inch of land. And so what we are trying to do is expand the capacity of the land that we do have to allow more children and adults to play on fields that we have. And it is a very difficult dilemma. If we had tons of space and we could put natural fields everywhere, maybe that would be the right answer. Although I do have to say, I wonder, because we have to use water and chemicals, particularly chemicals on them. And we know chemicals aren't good for kids too. But we do have a lot of call from parents who want kids to be put in formal activities. And so we have found, probably over the last 30 or 40 years, that many more of our children are signed up for soccer or, basketball or lacrosse, whatever sports there are. And so all of a sudden our fields have a really, really high demand. And so what we're trying to do is weigh, how do you expand the number of fields that you have? And if we can make one field work for many more hours in a day, that's one way that we can do it, because we don't have a lot of land to be able to do that in. So do we just not allow them to play sports, or do we try to find some way? So those are some of the kinds of issues that we're really trying to deal with. And I think that's the delicate balance that we're faced with.
I
Did I answer
appreciate
your
that.
question?
No, I appreciate that, and I think we're all trying to do the best.
Thank you. I agree. We are.
My question had to do with the vote on.
Yes.
My sense is it's a divided park board, because we heard from different people, a different perspective. And so on the last vote on these fields, was it unanimous to put the trash?
I think
tires
it was probably 7-2. I think that's about right. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So it's generally, we have never not passed a field because we had votes against it. Let me put it that way. So.
Okay. Thank you, President
Thank
Tabb. Council President Johnson. And I'll just note we have 3 more people waiting to speak, and just for folks to consider that, we have Councilmember Bender, Councilmember Andrew Johnson, Councilmember Frey for a second time. Excuse me.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I served on this council with Kathy Thurber, who was a park board commissioner. And I remember her, one of her daughters broke her leg on one of the fields that was overused in the Minneapolis park system. And I remember her talking about that and how upset she was about her daughter stepping into a hole in a soccer game and breaking her leg. And I commend the park board for stepping into the use of artificial fields because it does provide for a more safe playing surface for kids. It isn't just the chemicals either. All of these natural fields, we have animals that get into them that make holes. I mean, it's a huge maintenance cost to think about natural fields. And so anyway, but the other thing I want to say is the park board is an independently elected board. We have no authority or no responsibility to tell them how to do their business. And they are the ones that are responsible for the actions that they take. And for us to be telling the park board and the school board how to manage their facilities, maybe they'll come and tell us that maybe we shouldn't have fixed the clock face because, we took down the old fluorescent and are replacing it with something that people don't like. This is crazy. We need to take care of what the city's business is and not delve into independently elected boards of work. And we are exceeding our charge when we do this, and it really, to me, is offensive.
I believe Councilmember Bender was next, and then Councilmember Andrew Johnson. I apologize if I...
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess my question is for staff. Is it the position of the park board that there is a definitive evidence that this material is not toxic to children? Is that the official position that you're presenting here?
Chair Glidden, Councilmember Bender. I'm not sure we would go that far. I think we believe the science is not yet settled, and that making a determination to prohibit a particular material before that would be premature.
What do you say to the parents who are concerned that without definitive evidence that the material is safe, that they are concerned for the health of their children?
Chair Glidden, Councilmember Bender, that's a difficult question for me to answer. I can say again that the
Superintendent Miller, I think, is good.
Chair Glidden and Council Member Bender, I think that our organization does an incredible job around community engagement, and we do not make any decisions or any recommendations to our board without an extensive community engagement process. And as Adam articulated, when it comes to fields and what kinds of fields to put in, where to put them in, those recommendations are put forward not by our staff, but by the community advisory committees that are established that drive that process. And so, the concerns get raised by parents, and those advisory committee members are community members who make recommendations to our board. And so to say that we all agree one way or another how things should be handled, we never do. But because of our extensive community engagement process and because decisions that our board makes are based on community input, that gets vetted, and those decisions get vetted by the community in every single neighborhood park where we're doing any improvements.
Thank you. I think I'll then just add a brief comment. Many have shared their personal perspectives. We all, as elected officials, try to use data and information, but we do come to the table with a personal perspective. Mine includes having been diagnosed with cancer when I was 32. And we have seen increasing rates of cancer, colorectal cancer, breast cancer, like I had, among young people. And there seems to be mounting scientific evidence that it is from toxins in our environment. So I support the parents who are coming forward with concerns about using our children as experiments and hoping that toxic chemicals don't cause them to have cancer as young people. I appreciate the comments of Councilmember Gordon advocating for children in our community that are at risk from lifelong health impacts and the financial costs that come with them because of exposure to toxins in our environment, which again is not disputable. Not disputable. I think we'll have to turn to our attorneys for, really their perspective on what our reach is as a body. But as an elected official in this city, I feel comfortable with my role being at least to advocate for families who are concerned about the health of their children. Again, I don't believe for a second that anyone who serves in office in our city doesn't care about the health of our children. But when we have to weigh the pros and cons, I feel very strongly that we should err on the side of caution and protection of the health of our children. So I supported this resolution in committee, and I intend to continue supporting it going forward. My 5-year-old told me that in the playground that she plays at school, not a park system facility, the children go back to school covered in the black elements. She's 5. This is how she described it to me. Her friend came back to class and couldn't get it off of her body. So our children know that they're being covered in a substance that I don't think anyone can definitively say isn't causing threat to their health. Thanks.
Councilmember Andrew Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. With the phrase "the science isn't settled yet," it's something I've heard a lot. I think it's used with climate change deniers. And I just want to point to the fact that when the City Council banned indoor vaping, that was actually the term that was used by opponents of that ban the most. They kept saying, the science isn't settled yet, the science isn't settled yet, even though we had ample evidence there are toxins in this vapor, and it is being permeated throughout an area that other people are breathing in. On the specific side that said that the Washington State study did not find any, or it actually said there's no cancer risk, I believe is what that slide said with the Washington State study. I looked at that study myself. It says, in that study, assurance of the safety of artificial turf with crumb rubber is limited by the lack of adequate information on potential toxicity and exposure. Now, I'll agree, maybe there is a very low or negligible risk of cancer, but that doesn't mean there are not other health risks such as endocrine disruption, which really occurs at lower levels of toxicity than what would trigger something like cancer. And we're aware of that. I mean, that information even came out of Minnesota, where we saw frogs developing multiple legs because of the endocrine disruption that's occurring. And children are particularly sensitive to this exposure to toxins and hormonal disruptions and all the different adverse health effects that can occur from this. Now, what I think the Washington study was really getting at, what I, upon reviewing it, was really getting at, which I think we can all agree with, is that it's really, really healthy for kids to go out and be physically active. But the difference is that there's not an either-or scenario where if you move away from artificial, or if you move away from this toxic tire waste, that suddenly kids can't be active and can be healthy. There are different alternatives where we can still have that same level of physical activity occurring. When it comes to the science not being settled, the fact is the science is settled that toxic tire waste does contain terrible chemicals for your health, such as volatile organic compounds, phthalates, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, and a whole other host of known disruptive, health impeding and impacting compounds. And so I'm glad that they're studying this tire waste and looking for even more evidence to show what I think we intuitively know. Because there are these toxins in this material, it's probably not a good thing for people to be breathing in and playing with. In the meantime, I would hope and encourage, and I think the spirit of the resolution is encouraging our public partners to opt when they have the opportunity for healthier products. Because at the end of the day, yes, it might cost a little less for the tire mulch, but there are alternatives available that are healthier, that don't have those toxic compounds in them. And I do think that it is the city's role to stand up for the health of our children and our residents. And so that's why I supported the resolution at committee, and I certainly hope that the council does so. And I appreciate the perspective of our park board partners, and I understand that obviously you're trying to constantly balance all these things, and I appreciate that you're trying to get people out and be active. I would just really, really hope that in doing that, we also have high standards that we say, okay, this toxic waste material, we're not going to use it. Let's go with a different alternative, even if it might cost a little more, because we know that there's consequences to doing this, and that's not a healthy material.
All right, last comment or question, Councilmember Frey.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. So, I do agree with both Councilmember Andrew Johnson as well as Councilmember Bender that the evidence is not conclusive at this point to rule out the possibilities of detriment to health. I did talk with some of the proponents of the underlying resolution in the last week, and I may have misunderstood, but I believe there was a distinguishing factor between tire mulch, which is predominantly found in playgrounds, and crumb rubber that is predominantly found in fields. And again, I could be wrong, so I'm happy to be corrected, but I believe the primary concern was of little kids playing on the playgrounds in the tire mulch and ingesting some form of this rubber. And so I guess I would welcome, and so I guess the first question is, what is the practical difference other than, of course, size between tire mulch and then crumb rubber? And anybody that can correct me if I'm wrong as to what is the underlying concern of the mulch, as I understood it, over the crumb.
So we might have staff from Park Board talk about the difference as you see it, and if there is an intention. I think on the resolution, that's more a question of Councilmember Gordon.
So to address the council member's question about just the difference with the waste tire products, there's two processes in order to make shredded tire usable. In a playground, it's typically shredded, where you just literally take the tires themselves. There's a machine that just breaks them up into very small pieces, and it gets used that way.
And that's the mulch?
That's mulch.
Okay.
Crumb rubber, the process generally associated with crumb rubber is you cryogenically freeze the tire itself, and then it gets beaten down, essentially with hammers, until it becomes very, very, very small, tiny particles. And then with that, when you talk about crumb rubber in fields, it's a combination of that product itself, the very small broken down pieces of the tire, mixed in with the sand material that adds as the ballast. So it's kind of a two materials that make up that crumb rubber for synthetic.
So it's cryogenically frozen for the crumb rubber, and then sand is added to it.
In the crumb rubber for infill material.
Okay. And then I just had a question for our attorney. Ms. Siegel, can you just kind of elaborate on how we can act and how we cannot act? I heard the testimony from the park board explaining the conflict with parks agreement that we previously passed, and you just want to know if that's accurate, if there's inaccuracies, what can we do, what we can't do, based on the resolution and the agreement.
Ms. Siegel, and this may be something where there's some immediate response and additional response later. So,
Madam Chair and Councilmember Frey, there are matters over which health and wellness regulations that the city would have the authority to enact, but there are a lot of ifs, ands, whats, or buts, because the park board in our charter is a separately elected board, and there are real divisions between what is the city of Minneapolis, the city council's responsibility, and what is within the park board's responsibility. But the city, in terms of general kind of health and wellness, regulations, it does have some general authority, albeit I don't think the city can pick and choose between who will be regulated by that. But it's a broad question with that I can't answer right now in any specific detail.
So I agree. I guess perhaps I'll clarify the question a little bit, and we may need to take a little bit of time to get back on it, which is fine. Yeah, I agree with you that the city has the ability to regulate for the health and general welfare of the public in general. The question, I think, is more contractual in nature. It's to whether the contract that we previously signed with the park board to allocate the $10.5 or whatever it is $1 million on an annual basis also has language in it that restricts us from telling them how to use the money. If it doesn't, then obviously we can act here and pass a resolution. If it does, then to what extent are we prohibited?
Madam Chair and Councilmember Frey, I don't want to answer that question on the fly. I want to review the actual council action on that funding. The document that accompanied it before I answer that question.
All right. Thank you, Councilmember Frey. Those are the end. And so I will say thank you to the park board for staying and responding to the large number of questions. I really appreciate it. With that, I'll just note to my colleagues that we are kind of late in the hour. We still have 4 committees that could give reports. I'm actually going to ask if you might hold on giving a read-through of your report unless there's something significant or important that you want to alert us as your colleagues to. And so I'll just turn it to Public Safety, Civil Rights, Emergency Management. Councilor Yang, anything that you would like to highlight for the council?
Thank you, Madam Chair. We can pass on ours.
Okay. Transportation and Public Works, Councilmember Reich.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. The committee is forwarding 14 items for full council consideration. The first 2 items are regarding the concrete street rehabilitation program. There's an adjustment to the area that will be included in the project, and then the nature of the project and costs associated. Similarly, items 3 and 4 are regarding the resurfacing project at the Lakewood Harriet area. And again, it's for designation and amounts for those projects to move forward. Item 5 is the agreement with the Minnesota Department of Transportation for landscaping improvements at the North Loop neighborhood. Item 6 is the agreement with Hennepin County for reconstruction of the Cedar Avenue, Franklin Avenue, and Minnehaha Avenue intersection. Item 7 is agreement with the State of Minnesota Department of Transportation for Central Avenue and University Avenue Signal and ADA pedestrian ramp improvements. Item 8 is a contract amendment with Lucy Laney School pedestrian crosswalk project. Item 9 is a grant acceptance from Hennepin County TOD for the 4th Street Southeast project as listed. Item 10 is the Penn Oliver Concrete Street Rehabilitation. It's a project designation and setting the public hearing. That public hearing is listed for May 2nd. Item 11 is the 5th Street Southeast Bridge layout approval. Item 12 is the 18th Avenue Northeast Trail easement, and that's an easement to create some right-of-way so that project can move forward as designed. Item 13 is the capital project closeouts and appropriation and revenue adjustments for the city capital project enterprise funds. Those actions are listed, and the final item is accepting a low bid for some material for the
department. I'll stand for questions.
Thank you. Next, Ways and Means, and I might ask Councilmember Quincy if you just want to highlight anything of significance.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. There are 14 items. The bulk of them are all contractual amendments and contracts. So what of note is the collective bargaining agreement with the Police Officers Federation and the staff direction that was establishing a downtown public asset committee. This is to evaluate operational needs and recommend ongoing capital investments that may occur outside the typical budget process. So that was a follow-up to the one of the staff directions from the budget process. That's the highlights of that.
Thank you. And finally, we have the Zoning and Planning Committee with Council Member Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We just have 3 items from Zoning and Planning, including the local historic landmark designation of the Armory, a rezoning for an apartment building, and the receiving of a small area plan.
Thank you very much. With that, we've concluded our business and we are adjourned. Thank you.